All right, so let's get back to some of the serious stuff. So looking at the four things, as I've mentioned before, in terms of trying to be kind of a better contributor and making a difference, a positive difference. So last time I talked about the why. The why is kind of the all-encompassing. Everything else in this kind of short list of four things kind of all depends on that. So that's kind of the starting point. Understand why something is happening, why it matters to you, and then what you can do about it. So the next thing that I think is important in terms of something that people should internalize is the not looking at the now, which seems to be it's the most attractive thing, to look at what's happening today, what makes you feel good at this moment in time. I'm gonna buy a really expensive car. It's awesome. It gives me a little bit of that thrill, a little bit of that kind of that social status boost, and just kind of hits all the right endorphins. For me, the way I tend to operate and what I try to kind of do by example is to think about the future. So, what am I doing now that helps the tomorrow? I think that it's a really important concept to kind of get because, as I mentioned, like, in the immediate now of things, gone here today, gone tomorrow kind of thing, right? And it doesn't necessarily allow for all of these individual actions to lead towards something. And like I said, when you're looking at why, you're getting a bit of the sense of then what do you want to do, and then we'll kind of talk about like goals and the outcome. That's kind of in the next video. But the idea is that that path starts by thinking about what you're doing that can help the tomorrow, you know. Again, like I'd mentioned in previous videos, there's a bit of that cascade effect. Like if I talk to three people and those three people talk to others, then there's kind of a long-term benefit and a long-term gain. I think that I kind of, through kind of all my past experiences, have just kind of been by default, kind of a patient individual. I tend not to need to like rush into something, and I can deal with not getting satisfaction for a long period of time without it like driving me nuts. So to me, it's I kind of try to strive towards the long-term gain, and that's not to say that the short term isn't important to, again, things like mental health. They depend on these things. You need to be able to give yourself bits of satisfaction because immediate gratification helps kind of push us along, at least in my experience and in my opinion. So the thing though is to see whether or not there are things that you can do that give you the gratification that also help towards that long-term goal. It's very hard sometimes to see, if I do this or I sacrifice this, in the long term, there's going to be much better, results. So you want to think and like, to maybe most explain this concept, look at like things like, you've heard of like the Blockbuster stuff, Blockbuster, they used to be big time, and then we went into like the online streaming, and then that kind of just died away. The long-term game is about trying to figure out what things look like in the future, and then how can, so if you're a business, so, let's say you're a Best Buy, what happens when, like Amazon now is encroaching in, will TVs always be kind of a mainstay in stores? Or are we kind of moving towards new technology that might see a difference in the usefulness? Like if I can roll a TV in a tube, which is kind of what some of these OLED TVs are about, I don't need a huge store to stock them up. I can just kind of send that tube, and it's fairly light. And so what then do I need to do, thinking that like, yes, I need to kind of think about the now, but how do I get my consumer base to then think about the future along with me and kind of guide them towards that. That's from like a you know, business standpoint, but even like independently and individually, you know, in terms of the good that you can do, I think that it's really important for us to think about, you know, well, starting this thing, maybe I get no interest today, but in 3 months' time, there might be a lot more people who will come by. I know people who have started like little businesses to support charities and stuff like that. So, you know, whatever it is that you feel that you can contribute, again, it's about that contribution, and it's about thinking about not necessarily the now, because that now gets really individualized. Like it's very hard, you know, in a case of emergency or crisis, the reaction, yeah, like you will sometimes not necessarily be individual. You're thinking about how you're connecting and leveraging everyone's strengths. But in a long-term planning situation, you know, where you're like, okay, well, what's the strategy? And I find that a lot of the time, at least in kind of the environments that I work in and swim in and just live in here in Canada, there's a lot more reactionary tendencies, because we tend to be, you know, a lot more in that kind of polite realm. Like I don't want to bother you, so I'm just going to kind of wait, and then if you're okay with this, then I'm going to do something. The idea is, you know, ask yourself why, and then ask yourself about what the longer term looks like. It also helps with things like anxiety and, you know, tunnel vision, because it helps kind of when you see something in the long term, you start to realize that there are other things that connect to it, that you can also tackle or look for people to help you tackle and so forth. So that's kind of the take on this piece. And in the next video, like I said, we'll be talking more about kind of those goal-oriented pieces, which are kind of like, you know, we've done the starting point, the path, and then we need to get to like the end result. So we'll talk about that next.